Welcome to Life by Design, episode 410. Welcome to Life by Design. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards, and I'm not joined today by my colleague, Dr. Cracia Jug. Today we're talking about salt, everything you need to know about salt. I would say salt is one of the most demonized nutrients, especially over the last few decades. And if you go back and look at some of the research, there's no question that it's murky at best. And as usual in some of these areas of nutrition specifically, we tend to, I think, get caught up in what we should do in very extreme situations. So a lot of the studies that are done on a nutritional basis, and really just medical research in general, they tend to study sick people. And therein lies one of the big issues is we're studying sick people and then documenting what every other person should do. It's important to recognize that there's a difference between, someone who has severe chronic kidney dysfunction and a regular person. And of course, even if you go beyond someone who has severe chronic kidney dysfunction into someone who maybe has no kidney dysfunction but is far from health, and then continue to scale up all the way towards what optimal health could look like, there's a huge spectrum. Now, as I said, the research is murky at best, but yet many of the, especially heart and stroke type associations, often recommend very, very low limits of salt. So why do they do that? What should we be doing? Who does this apply to? What sources of salt should we be consuming? How much? Let's get in and answer some of those questions today. Salt, really what we're talking about is sodium, and salt tends to be the delivery system for sodium. Sodium is a major component of our extracellular fluid. So you think about things like your blood and lymph fluid, and one of its primary roles is to help maintain pressure. And obviously pressure is very important when we talk about blood pressure, and I think we tend to fall towards this high blood pressure as being a major problem. And there are ranges where high blood pressure does become a severe or an emergency situation. But even over the last many years, the target tends to move. And so this 120/80 as being the quote unquote normal blood pressure has, really changed and been modified to different, standards in terms of what is expected for blood pressure. And, when you look at this situation, the same is true. We're looking at, what should the body be taking in, what is normal, and for whom. And so when it comes to sodium, the 1,500 milligram a day lower limit, which some of the organizations are suggesting, is obviously, in my world, based on the research that I've read, my interpretation is it's extremely low. And yes, there's a certain amount of sodium that we need in order just to maintain normal function, whether it be 500 or 600 milligrams per day. But again, there's a certain amount of vitamin D that we need in order to not, develop rickets. That doesn't mean it's the ideal amount of vitamin D for optimal function. And so the same is true here. And going back to this idea, maintaining pressure is important because pressure is what is pushing, nutrients into our, tissues. It's important in terms of the regulation of just normal function for our body. When the pressure is too low, it's a problem. When the pressure is far too high, it becomes a problem, damaging tissues and so on. And so if we're sweating a lot, if we're urinating a lot, those would be situations where we're getting rid of sodium. And when I talk about the spectrum of what is ideal, if you are on the end of, regular, consistent exercise and you're sweating a lot, you're going to be towards the upper end of that. And if you're more sedentary and sweating less, you're probably going to be towards the lower end of that. In the case of someone who does truly have kidney dysfunction, whether it be acute or chronic kidney dysfunction, yes, you probably should work with your physician to determine how much sodium is appropriate for you. But if you don't fall into those categories, it's unlikely that you need to restrict your sodium. The simplest approach here, and we'll talk about what forms of sodium, or let's use salt in terms of where we're going to target this, what would be a normal, easy way to do this is simply just salting your food. That's probably going to get you a significant part of the way if you're just salting your food to taste. Now, everybody's got slightly different taste buds, and our interpretation of what is salty and not, and what we like and don't like may be different, but that's a good start. If we look at the total amount, depending on where you fall in that spectrum, whether it be someone who's exercising, as I said, and removing sweat and you're getting rid of sodium that way, you're probably going to fall in the upper end of this, 3,000 to 7,000 milligram per day sodium levels. Now that is a far cry from what is being recommended at 1,500 milligrams or 2,500 milligrams. The average North American, I think the range is about 4,300 milligrams. So really not that far off. The issue is that most of their sodium is coming in forms that are really devoid of other nutrients. So if you're using table salt and highly processed form of salt, other than the addition of iodine, which may be beneficial, but could also be gathered in other forms and sources that would be better than table salt. Of course, if people are consuming foods that are highly processed, then extra sodium is being placed in there. And as with any average, if the average is 4,300, then there's all kinds of people that are consuming far less than that, which means that average is getting pulled up by people who are consuming far more than that. So it's likely there's a large group of people that are way above the 7,000 milligram amount. And then we've got all these people who are restricting salt, and that brings the average into 4,300. Now, what's the ideal? As I said, somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 milligrams a day, unless you're dealing with some type of acute or chronic kidney dysfunction. There's some studies that suggest that that's a great range. There's some studies that, as I said, are showing that the results, or at least what we're basing a lot of the clinical suggestions are murky. The InterSalt study is a great study to look at, gather up some more information there, and just really recognizing that the amount of sodium intake does not correlate in a linear sense to people who have more salt intake by country don't necessarily have higher incidence of heart and stroke. Now, some places that have higher sodium intake have higher heart conditions, some have higher stroke, some have lower, and so you get the idea that it's all over the place. And so there's not really a linear relationship that way. So it really comes down to about 1.5 to 3.5 teaspoons of salt a day, or in the sense of what we're going to consume. So what do we want to look for? Highly mineralized forms of salt. Sea salt, Himalayan, pink sea salt, those are a great way. So how are we going to apply this? Salt our food to taste. And I personally like to add about 1/2 teaspoon, upwards of a teaspoon to my mix at night before bed. So I'll do some salt, Himalayan pink salt. I will do and add magnesium, and I'll add in some vitamin C into that as well. And I'll have some collagen. And that's my nighttime drink that I'll take. And it's another great way to add that in, especially, if you are dealing with sleep issues, relaxation issues, and even if you aren't, we should just add those in simply because they're required. So as always, guys, anything from today's episode, I'll put in the show notes. Short and sweet, but super important in terms of what you need to know about salt. And hopefully this challenges some of the myths that are out there that people are buying into, and it could be and probably is truly affecting your health in a big way. So thank you for joining the drive to 1 million families worldwide living life by design.